I'm in competition with St. Francis Assisi tonight. I don't want to be in competition with him. But on the other hand, maybe he'll shed his grace and love and all of that upon us as we meet on this feast day here. So welcome back to most of you who were here last week. I don't think all of you were. But this is the sort of course where you can come for any one of the installments, and it will still make sense. Not cumulative sense, but sense. So let's begin with the invocation of the Holy Spirit, wisdom. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful people. Kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created. Father, you instruct the hearts of your faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit. Grant us in that same Spirit to savor what is right, and always to rejoice in his consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So last week I presented what was necessarily, inevitably, a rather dry compilation of some of the ways that pretty conventional Catholic theology over the centuries has talked about faith, and especially as it came down to us, in our catechism and in our devotional materials, from in the first part of the 20th century. Even this past Sunday, I was startled to see that the theme was faith in the readings. If you were at the Catholic Mass this past Sunday, it even referred to, we had a reading from Habakkuk where that one verse, the just one shall live by whatever you translate faith. Emunat in Hebrew means fidelity, right? Just or live by his faithfulness. But St. Paul used that at the beginning of Romans 1:17 as the basis. He quoted that verse and used it as the basis for his whole theology. That is by grace and faith in Christ that we are saved, and not by doing any works of the law. And he took faith in a broader sense, but still in the biblical sense, Jesus' own sense in the gospel, trusting oneself. And we'll see that again in a moment. But I also commented in my homily that the word in the second reading, we talked about the deposit of faith, guard the deposit of faith, and how that became, and we talked about this last week, if the faith became the faith, like it was something, the deposit, something we have to hold, and have to keep precious and protected. It was like it's something, the faith. Then I noticed, I think for the first time, the same word is used for a few verses earlier when Paul says, I know the one in whom I have believed, and that's what faith is. This is trust in someone, in the Christian sense, and I know that he's able to keep my deposit until that day, the day of judgment. So the deposit there became something in Paul, something Paul's own experience of God. So right there in a couple of verses you have, these. I wish that first part with the deposit that's within us, sharing the divine life, I wish that had as much currency in Christian history as thinking of the deposit of faith that we have to guard, something almost external to ourselves. Anyway, what I would like to do today, and I mentioned at the end of last, as a result of Bill's question, I mentioned we'd be talking about it today, a book that has been for me, in my own personal evolution, paramount because of its clarity and kind of almost really provocative way of presenting an evolution in faith from not only a spiritual point of view, a theological point of view, but also from a human psychological point of view, and enlarging the concept of faith to include really all humans. Now, James W. Fowler was Methodist and a professor of theology, a minister, but specialized, in developmental psychology and ethics, and these are, in other words, from faith from the psychological perspective. I just looking up more about him today, I discovered that he died just exactly a year ago, October 2015, at the age of 75. But he published this in 1981, so he was born in 1940, so that's kind of like the midlife midlife crisis where, you do start, hopefully, questioning faith and growing and evolving in faith from that developmental, psychological point of view. But let me not put words in his own mouth. In his own introduction to the book, he actually speaks about a moment of unprecedented aloneness in his 33rd year. So in Levenson's presentation, there's usually an age 30 type crisis where once you've gotten your basic identity down, the business of your 20s, you marry, you're going to get a career most of the time, and then there's, okay, now what? And he did experience, as he describes himself, waking up at 4 a.m. in the darkness of cold winter morning, married already, he has a life. But he's saying, when all these persons and relations and projects that shape and fill my life are removed, who or what is left? When this biological embodiment of me ceases to function, is there? Will there be any I? And when the I that is me steps into the velvet darkness, will there be the center of consciousness, this I am or not? And if so, by whom will whoever that is, will I be met? So it's this existential coming up against the darkness, the mystery, within the context of someone who's already a Christian, already has faith. But he says in the next paragraph, faith is a coat against the nakedness. For most of us, most of the time, faith functions so as to screen off the abyss of mystery that surrounds us. So it's a way of dealing with the mystery, the ultimate mystery. But it can also become, as he says, a screen. So it can become a protection in the good and the bad sense. Bad in the sense that, you have to plunge further in the name of the very faith that you already have and that's brought you where you are. So it says this book is about faith. Faith at a deeper level, he says, faith undergirds us when our life space is punctured and collapses. Often it takes a life crisis to help us grow in faith, or if you will, doubt. And that's the first thing that we have to realize, that doubt is ultimately, should be, and could be, and ought to be, and is meant to be a positive force in our growth in faith. Sometimes you say without doubt there's no faith. Well, it doesn't just mean, well, sometimes you're not sure. But no, it means without plunging deeper in a plunge of faith, there is no faith, because faith needs to grow and go deeper all the time. And that's what he's talking about in the book, and that's what hopefully we experience. So this is kind of like a humanized map of what that can look like, across the board. So when the felt reality of our ultimate environment proves to be less than ultimate, see? The phrase ultimate environment will come up again as we discuss the book in a moment. But most of the time, what we think is ultimate isn't. If we're thinking of the ultimate, what we think is ultimate is by definition not ultimate, because we're thinking it. And what can be thought is not ultimate, as any mystic will tell you, of any tradition. So that's why faith always has to grow, and why there are stages of faith, which is the title of the book. So, and he begins his first chapter by talking about human faith. In other words, faith, even though he's a Christian, and we're often talking in a religious context, and most of us here are in that context, it's a human phenomenon. And faith in whatever tradition, or faith without a faith, quote, faith, religious tradition, is universal and human experience. And this is what he means by it. And this is what a person can ask himself or herself to say, well, what do I put faith in? What are you spending and being spent for? What commands and receives your best time and your best energy? What causes, dreams, goals, or institutions are you pouring out your life for? As you live your life, what power or powers do you fear or dread? What power or powers do you rely on and trust? To what or whom are you committed in life, in death? With whom or what group do you share your most sacred and private hopes for your life and for the lives of those you love? And finally, what are those most sacred hopes? Those most compelling goals and purposes in your life? So your answers to that will tell you what your faith is. What are your goals and whom do you trust? What powers do you trust? So some could just be you, yourself. I trust in myself. But you're trusting in something or someone. Without it, you can't live a human life. Later in the book, he makes it even more succinct, but including all of those points. This is what he says. In the most formal and comprehensive terms I can state it, faith is people's evolved and evolving ways of experiencing self, others, and world as they construct them. As related to and affected by the ultimate conditions of existence as they construct them. And as shaping their lives' purposes and meanings, trusts and loyalties in light of the character of being, value, and power, determining the ultimate conditions of existence as grasped in their operative images, conscious and unconscious. That's a little, you gag over that. Right. Those first questions, I think are pretty clear. So it's a human phenomenon. So faith is not always religious in its content or context. It's a basic human phenomenon. And there are those basic traits which are true of any faith. So it's a search for an overarching, integrating, grounding trust in a center of value and power, sufficiently worthy to give our lives unity and meaning, as he says. And he quotes some Protestant theologians, which we're actually going to look at ourselves in a couple of weeks, so I won't dwell on that now. So then, in the second chapter, he talks about, so faith defined as that is not the same as religion. Not only can you have faith without any religion at all, but even with your religious, faith is before that. Religion is kind of a concretization or institutionalization of something which is, first of all, a personal act on your part. The faith is personal and it antedates that. So there can be a confusion, let's say, faith and religion. And above all, this is the point I was also making last week, confusion of faith and belief. And this is very common today among people who have or don't have faith, both of them. You think faith and belief are the same thing. Belief in the sense of a list of beliefs, whereas faith is the inner attitude. It can be formulated adequately or inadequately, and ultimately inadequately, by a belief system within a religion, or religions. But faith is the personal attitude before that. And then he goes into a number of pages, and this is the point I made last week, about the etymologies. Even in Hinduism, as he says here, Shraddha means set one's heart on. So it's a commitment of heart, it's an existential attitude. It's something very personal and interior. And, as I mentioned, Greek and Latin, Pistero and Credo have the same thing. And he even takes in the old German, where we get the word belief. The Lieben in German, as you may know, means love. So belieben, if you believe, you're believing in someone. So it's a relational thing. So even all the words, that we look at here are above all an inner attitude that we're talking about. So it's not concretized in religion, and much less is it concretized in belief in the first instance. So he says faith, rather than belief or religion, is the most fundamental category in the human quest for relation to transcendence. And each of the major religious traditions studies and speaks about faith in some way, in a way that can cover all the traditions. Even though each one is particular in a certain way, there's this general basic attitude that can be recognized in each one of them. And it's not a separate dimension of life, it's the overarching and undergirding attitude towards life, as he's been saying, as I've been saying. So that's what he has to say about that. And then he has a chapter on faith and relationships. You can see already where that's going. Faith is a relationship. It's an inner attitude towards yourself, your career, the transcendent, whatever is the community, whatever it might be. His faith is always relational. And he even uses the word covenantal. It's a covenant. You're entrusting yourself to whatever. And a covenantal, using a biblical term, whenever you're entering into a relationship of trust, which is what a covenant is. So that's an important thing. And as he says, it really does form your identity, since it's an ultimate relationship towards something. It undergirds and overarches everything that is, really does form your identity. Whatever you have faith in, you're forming your identity in relation to that, because it's an ultimate type of commitment of self. So it really does determine and name your own identity. And then he has an interesting section on the 3 types of possible faith-identity relations. He uses, this is very clever, he uses the theological terms for polytheism, henotheism, and monotheism to show different types of faith relationships that you can have. So for example, if you're polytheistic, so to speak, you can, well, I like music, and I like architecture, and I like this, or I like that, and I do this, and I do that, and that gives you kind of an identity and a meaning, and that's what you give your energy to, but you're kind of not really committed totally to any one of those things. It's kind of like being a polytheist in terms of faith. Then he speaks of henotheism, which, as you may know, means that you do have a one center, but you don't believe it's exclusive. Like the ancient Israelites believed in their God, but not as the only God until later under the 6th century BC, etc., under Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah. So he quotes the example, someone might be a doctor, and his whole life is being a doctor, and his whole energy is being a doctor, and then someone asks him, well, who are you when you're not a doctor? Well, nothing, nobody. How ultimate is that? I mean, so you're giving your energy to something, it's not an ultimate, transcendent kind of thing. But I mean, it can be your faith. It can be what you dedicate your energy to. But in the end, it doesn't make you holy, it makes you a workaholic. And by the way, he does say, you can ask the same thing of a minister or a priest. Who are you when you're not a priest? So we have to be really careful. I mean, if we're not, I mean, if you want to go deeper, plunging into that darkness that wakes you up at 4 in the morning, you've got to be more than what your career is. So that's more of an ultimate concern. And then monotheism, of course, is well, when your ultimate concern is an ultimate transcendent reality, however you define it, look into it. As we get towards the end of the introductory chapters, he has Roman faith as imagination. Now that's really interesting, because notice, imagination, symbols, there's so much part of our life, whether we're artists or whether we're theologians, mystics, poets, and as Thomas Aquinas would say, it's the way we function as human beings. Even our concepts come from our images, as Thomas Aquinas insisted. There's nothing in your concepts which is not first in your perceptions and in your images. So it really is important, the images and the symbols that we use, and they're integral to our faith. The exact relation of faith to the image is one of the things we'll be talking about in a minute. But it is a fundamental type of relationship. And he does make an interesting point, a couple of interesting points towards the end of the chapter where he says, our images will change and mature and evolve, die and be born again. So in this sense, substantive doubt is a part of the life of faith. The point I made just a moment ago. He says it in so many words here. And then on the bottom of the page, he says, so the opposite of faith, as we consider it here, is not doubt, it's nihilism. When there's nothing that holds, no image, no system, no person, no reality which holds your allegiance. He says that's going way beyond doubt. It's going into nihilism. There always needs to be something, and should be something there. The inability, he says, to image any transcendent environment, and despair about the possibility of even negative meaning. That's an interesting phrase. Nihilism means you can't even imagine negative, because negative is always in relation to positive. So that's really nihilism. So we don't want that. And finally, just a few pages he has at the end of the introductory chapters on faith as a whole. We're talking about our reaction, our relationship. But remember, especially if we're talking about religious faith, it's in relation to the transcendent reality many of us call God, which takes the initiative in all this, and which is the partner, and it's the relation. Remember, faith is a relation. And if we're theists, then that relationship is with God. So those are some introductory remarks for his treatment of faith. Any questions so far?
Just later in the book, does he relate that to what I would think of as rigid dogma? Does he have...
Coming up.
Yeah, is that...
Coming up.
Kind of put up against that.
Well, that's why this book is so helpful, because it shows how that kind of attitude, which is often taken for real faith, is just a pretty preliminary stage on the journey, and you have to move beyond that. So that's what we're going to look at now. What are the stages of faith as he finds them existentially and phenomenologically, in the actual looking at the human condition. And he uses Levinson's view of the stages of life, and also, much more well-known, Erik Erikson's view of the stages of psychological development. He relates them to stages of faith. Yes?
Would you look at atheism as a kind of faith?
Well, not if it's nihilistic. But in that sense, you don't look at what it's not. You say, okay, what is an atheist actually then putting her or his faith in? And that's their faith. Well, I trust in science. So science is their faith. All right. But they can't live without it, literally.
Somebody lives in nihilist.
Well, then you become a nihilist and you commit suicide next morning. It's not an alternative I recommend. Because, there's always something. So he goes through 6 stages of faith, and we're going to look at them. And he collates them with stages of psychological development, especially as Erik Erikson points it out. And he does go through those psychological stages in that second part of the book. We're just going to skip over that and go right to the stages of faith. Now, this early one is part of infancy, really, very early years, and it's called intuitive projective faith. Intuitive projective faith. And he gives case studies and interviews in each of the chapters, so it's very almost clinical. So there's a lot of actual individual interviews with actual people that he uses to prove his point. But this is a pattern from 3 to 7, for example. So not just infancy, but in those very early years. The first self-awareness, okay. Birth of imagination, to unify and grasp the experiential and powerful images, kids and stories and monsters and imagery and all sorts of stuff. And this is where we start. That's why imagery remains very important. So they begin to form an attitude then towards the ultimate conditions of existence. In his summary at the end of these chapters, he gives positive aspects and also the dangers, in this stage that can arise. The possible possession, quotes, of the child's imagination by unrestrained images of terror and destructiveness. What's the home life like? Where are these feelings and images coming from? You can kind of derail the whole thing or cause trauma, very early on in this stage about trust, the ultimate trust in someone or something. If you can't trust your mommy and daddy or whatever. Or from the witting or unwitting, notice, witting or unwitting exploitation of his or her imagination in the reinforcement of taboos and moral or doctrinal expectations. So you can really do a number on these kids, if you're shaming them or guilting them, early on, because this is the stage that they're at. They're very on the level of imagination and very malleable emotionally. So it's very delicate. So try and use stories and images and emotions, that it can reinforce a positive trust in life. Now, stage 2 is called mythic literal faith. You can understand it even more clearly. Level of myth, so you're still on the level of myths, and they apply also in a sense not just to the growth and development of an individual person, but also in civilization. Early societies were mythic literal societies. I mean, they used myth. Study any primordial society across the globe, and they have myth stories, creation stories, often very graphic, about the gods and fighting or the dismemberment and all this stuff. So they have this very graphic, but then they also, however, take it literally very much of the time. So that's the trouble is there are some people who remain so really uneducated or informed that their faith stays at that level. And this is the level of later childhood, really, almost before reason comes in, as we'll be seeing. So this is. I have a friend who's a scientist and I believe a mystic himself, and he wrote a book called The Coming into Spiritual Age. I work with him in interfaith. His name is Dr. Kirk Johnson. And he says that sometimes when he gives lectures on spirituality, mysticism to scientific audiences, they boom down. And this is his theory, because they are thinking of faith as mythic literal. But they're understanding it as just these crazy stories. And let's face it, also in catechesis. If kids stop learning about the faith and coming to church when they're 13, after confirmation, and then they later grow up, emotionally, intellectually, and then they look back and say, this is it? This mythic literal, these stories of Adam and Eve and Noah and the flood and all that stuff, taken literally, mythic literal? Of course they reject that. But the error is they don't realize that's second stage. It's partly their fault, but it's partly the catechist's fault for not alerting them somehow. This is. But how do you do it? It's not easy. You can't give them a different. You can't start teaching them theology when they're 11. So it's a tricky thing. But this kind of mythic literal faith, is very, very, immature. And it's only second level. The stage that most people are at most of their lives, who have religious faith at all, is stage 3. Now notice, it's only halfway there. But that's where most people stay. And where most people think they're supposed to stay. And what most people think is being a person of faith. That's why a book like this is really important, unless they have access to the mystical tradition of their own religion, for example. It's another way of getting beyond this. But and it's called this level of faith synthetic conventional faith. So it's conventional faith. This is where most people are. And as he says somewhere in the book here, institutions identified with one particular tradition, so the church or the synagogue or whatever, tend to function most smoothly when you've got all stage 3 people around, who aren't, questioning, basic stuff, and who have pretty conventional understanding of the faith. What does it mean? Well, it means that you start getting a conceptual understanding, but it's entirely that of the community and the tradition that you're in and the authority figures that run it. So there's a constant appeal to authority, community, and tradition, and the conventional ways of understanding and practicing. So you're identified with your community. The individuality doesn't really come out. It's this kind of conformity to the God. One good way he says that you can understand this, for persons in stage 3 with its largely tacit system of meaning and value, so there's not self-critical at all. Doesn't ask questions. Remember when you were a kid, you were told, don't ask questions. With its largely tacit system of meaning and value, the symbols and ritual representations expressive of their faith are organically and irreplaceably tied to the full realities of their meaning systems. In other ways, said in another way, the symbols expressive of their deepest meanings and loyalties are not separable from what they symbolize. So in other words, the infinite mystery that's being signified is actually totally identified with the symbol, the particular symbol that's used. They can't separate it. So if you threaten a particular concept or a particular symbol by questioning it or trying to broaden it out, they feel their whole identity is being threatened. Rigid dogma, okay, I'm talking about. They can't make a separation. This is what I received, this is what I believe, and this is the way it is. And don't you come here to try and, puncture that in any kind of way, or even try and broaden it out. So as he says, any strategy of demythologization threatens the participation of symbol and symbolized, and is taken consequently as an assault on the sacred itself. You hear that all the time. The sacred is under assault. No, you're just being asked to examine a little more clearly the symbols you're using, or the concepts you have, or just how deep and applicable they are. But stage 3 can't do that. Or it's never even called to do that. You can stay within your community and never question anything, which is again what I say most people do. If they stay especially within the protection of their community. Of course, as he says, so if they go off to college, or they go travel, or they're exposed to any other kind of, for over a long period, well then there's going to be moving on to stage 4. But you can't stay within that. And as he says somewhere in the book too, I think he points out, for example, it's not a measure of holiness necessarily. You can kind of stay at that level of faith understanding and still become holy. I don't think it's easy. But there's an example of St. Teresa of Jesus, or even of St. Therese of Lisieux, or I would say even the other Teresa of Calcutta. And he would probably agree with me on that, the author, as I'll point out later. But these are women that stay squarely within their own cultural and intellectual and received understandings of the faith. They never went outside that in any kind of adventurous way. You should hear St. Teresa of Jesus speak about the Lutherans, and yet they all became saints. So I mean, it's possible. You can have a real loyalty and a real gift of yourself to what is really truly valuable there, and not get hung up, but on the formulations. But on the other hand, never go beyond that. So to say that someone is at stage 3 is not necessarily saying they're narrow-minded. Nonetheless, it can be dangerous. And this is, stage 3 is the trap of conservatives, okay, of whatever stripe. This is his summation of the stage 3. A stage 3 person has an ideology. It can become an ideology almost if you're not careful. A more or less consistent clustering of values and beliefs. But he or she has not objectified it for examination, and in a sense is unaware of having it. Remember, these are unquestioned. They're simply not questioned. And if they are, it's taken as a threat or an assault. The community feels this, or individuals feel that. So the dangers or deficiencies in this stage are twofold, he summarizes. These expectations and evaluations of others, remember authority, can be so compellingly internalized and sacralized that later autonomy of judgment and action can be jeopardized. So you never become an individual. Or, negatively, Interpersonal betrayals can give rise either to nihilistic despair, the community failed me, the sex crisis or whatever, about a personal and principle of ultimate being that you lose your faith entirely in that because it's fallen apart and you have no way to go beyond it. So he even mentions, changing the mass from Latin or no longer eating meat on Friday. They're so identified with the practices and the symbols that you can't see, well, what were they really for, and has it been into a larger picture? You feel threatened by that kind of thing. So as I say, this is the pitfall for conservatives. So any comment on that? That was kind of the. So in the sense that this is really central, this is what most people think of, whether they're inside the box or outside the box. This, I think, is what most people think of when they think of religious faith, stage 3 faith. It's only halfway there. Yes.
Isn't what you're talking about really the divide between pre-Vatican II and Vatican II?
Absolutely not. No, I'm talking about something much, much more primordial than that. I'm talking about what is the stage of a person's emotional, intellectual, and spiritual development? And what kind of faith normally characterizes that? And how does faith itself, by its own dynamism, grow and deepen? You can go look at Vatican II and the struggles and debates about it as exemplifying people in different stages. But that's just one among hundreds of examples that you could use throughout history. Of how these different levels can clash, especially if they don't understand, if they're not self-aware. Bill?
You talk to people on a stage yet becoming very holy people. I don't know enough about her works, but Teresa of Avila, if she was conventional, beginning yet to become a great mystic.
Yeah, so I don't know.
So somehow she went beyond it.
Well, she went beyond an experience, yes. But not in this self-understanding or formulation.
So not in the intellectual concept, but yet in her experience she went beyond.
Yes. So even when she came back, so quotes from her mystical experiences were certainly genuine. She didn't formulate it any other way than as she had understood it.
And Teresa the Little Flower, Thomas Merton once changed his mind back, thought he kind of dismissed her as very bourgeois at one point. Then he changed his mind and said she had heroic love, even though she was very conventional.
But that's what I'm saying. She had heroic love, even though she was very conventional. Yeah, so I'm not saying it's easy, but she did. So that's important to know. Yes.
Just one quick thing. I related to this a lot. We have a family member who's evangelical, and we're going to hell if we don't believe a certain way.
Yeah.
And
they're threatened by
right.
everything.
So this all, intellectualizes that living experience
Yes.
for us. And
Yes.
I guess my conclusion with that person is, because of the dangers that you mentioned, the nihilistic despair,
Yes.
I feel like they're standing on a house of cards.
Right,
And
but
I know where
don't
it
knock it
goes.
down.
But I don't want to knock it
Right.
down, so I feel like the kindest thing I
Right.
can do is stay away.
That's right.
I
And
can't approach the person.
and don't argue with it, but what you can do is image in your own life something else. Or
But I don't
something
think I
more.
can be physically with this
No.
person.
No.
And that's a shame, because they like to be, but I gotta be true to myself.
Absolutely.
And I don't want to hurt that person. with
Exactly.
it.
So that's a very evolved way of looking at it. You realize you have to go your own way, and that's just essential that you do that. On the other hand, you don't want to, interfere in a way that will be harmful or premature,
Because I know that this could happen.
Yes, yes. So that's right. That's right. So stage 4 is, and he says this usually happens, like in college, as I just mentioned, very early adulthood. For some people, it only comes in like in midlife, and I think as it did for me, for example. And he says that some people it happens in their 30s or 40s. It can happen for a lot of people when they, as I say, when they go away to college and discover there's a world way beyond, the suburbs where they grew up. And that's stage 4 is called individuative reflective faith. Individuative, so here we're getting beyond the community belonging and all that stuff and authority to individuals. You take stock of the world as you experience it and move beyond simply what's been received. Individuated reflective faith, so you're obviously reflecting on what you've received. And this is obviously where you begin, you begin to question based on new experience, new evidence, new interior evidence, your own interior struggles and growing up and discovering the world and yourself, other faiths, other political systems, other cultures, and you discover, wow, there's something, I have to look at this again, take a new look at it. It's really important. He says the two essential features of the emergence of stage 4 then are the critical distancing from one's previous assumptive value system and the emergence of an executive ego. So you get more self-confidence, more faith, if you will, in your own life experience and your own thinking. That's not self-centered, but as he points out, it's not selfish. It's just taking stock of the fact that the evidence, in my own experience needs to be heard. I have to be authentic. When, as these occur, a person is forming a new identity. Remember, faith and identity, so your identity is changing. And which is why it's so threatening and why it's so challenging and promising as well. So which he or she expresses and actualizes by the choice of personal and group affiliations and the shaping of a lifestyle. So you begin to change, possibly, most likely, your affiliations with groups, etc. So sometimes he says this doesn't. You don't always go through with the whole process. So in any cases, there needs to be an equilibrium between their own growth interiorly and then also associating with others on the outside. So stage 4 constructs a perspective genuinely aware of social systems and institutions. So you see the good and the bad, and you take a very sober view of what they can and can't do, whether religious institutions or political institutions or whatever. The richness of mutual and personal perspective, etc. So it works at apprehending other persons in terms of their personal qualities and taking into account, their experiences and their worldviews. So you're beginning to open up to that. And so the use of symbols is much freer in this stage. So he says the most appropriately, in the summary, it most appropriately takes form in young adulthood, but let us remember that many adults do not construct it, ever. And that for a significant group of them, it's only in their 30s or 40s, as I already pointed out. So the self, double development, the self now claims an identity no longer defined by the composite of one's roles or meanings to others, okay, as I explained. And to say that new identity composes a meaning frame conscious of its own boundaries and interconnections and aware of itself as a worldview. So a new worldview goes with this. So its strength is capacity for critical reflection on self and outlook, ideology. Its dangers inhere in its strength, an excessive confidence in their own thinking, and a kind of second narcissism, it can happen, in which the now clearly bounded reflective self over-assimilates reality and the perspectives of others into its own worldview. You can become restless with the self-images and outlook maintained there, and be ready for transition into the next grouping. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. This, by the way, and I've been helped to see this by Richard Warren, we'll be talking about later in the course. Whereas stage 3 is the danger of the conservative, stage 4 is the trap of liberals. In other words, they get so much confidence in their own judgment, in their own worldview, and they poo-poo the institutions and poo-poo all of that, and they're entirely independent and not connected, probably not engaged, some are, of course, But it can become a head trip, and it can become, well, I'm not one of those, poor, benighted people anymore, and then that's the end of it. So excessive confidence in their own liberated worldview that doesn't go any farther. That's the trap of the liberals. Yes?
Maybe I'm making these distinctions too rigid, but can't you be if you're in a stage 3 and you start to question, that means you're in a stage 4?
Well, you're getting
Or
there.
you're getting there, but...
It's not like there's a doorway.
No,
Okay, now.
that's what I said, I'm not trying to make these too
Yes.
rigid, but if you think the answer is to stay in the stage 3, that
That's stage
that
3.
the truth is there,
That's stage 3.
because it's more comfortable.
Yes.
I understand that, but what happens if you said you one day you're a liberal and you think that individually you have all the answers, but then you realize that the answers are actually back where you left them?
No, but that's the mistake. The answers are not back where you left them.
We have to go on to 5.
There ahead.
Okay, well, I'll wait for you to get there.
And that's where you begin to reconcile, the thing.
Oh, okay.
The inner and the outer in a new way.
Okay.
All right? That is a mistake that I've met people like that, in the course of my pastoral work, that they live these liberated individual lives, and then they discover, that's not getting me anywhere. Let's go back to the womb. Let's go back to the way it was. Let's go back to certainty and authority and clear rules and clear determinations, faith formulations. But that's just going backward. You can't do that. You shouldn't do that. So the real step is into stage 5, as we'll discuss in a second. Yes?
Well, it's 800 years later, so how can we judge a man's psychology? But St. Francis seemed to find the life of hedonism that he had kind of empty. And he, tremendous mystic, but he also seemed to have sometimes this very medieval Catholic view of Christianity. Where,
Of course. So you can't, as with St. Teresa of Jesus, you can't just judge by their mental universe because they're people of their times. But on the other hand, who else was visiting the soul?
Right, exactly.
Who else was saying brother, sun, and sister moon? I mean, come on. This is a huge opening up to the whole universe, which is what we're going to be talking about in a second.
Yeah, he seemed different from St. Dominic, for example, his contemporary.
He was an intellectual. That's always dangerous. Stage 5. And by the way, I couldn't find the quote in here, but at some point he says that people who are spiritual leaders, not just administrators, of which stage 3 institutions really like, just have people who are stage 3, but those who are real spiritual leaders must at least be stage 5. Otherwise, don't listen to them, or listen to them with caution. Take what's good in what they say, but not the limitations that are surrounding it. So what is conjunctive faith? Well, as it sounds, conjunctive means you're bringing together paradoxes. You're bringing together elements that have been, heaven and earth, body and soul, natural and supernatural, Christian and non-Christian, male and female, all individuals, community. This is where conjunction, and that's Jung's term too, mysterium conjunctionis. The mystery of conjunction, that's when the self with a capital S, when you reach real maturity. So when you bring together these various elements, in a more harmonious whole based on spiritual experience. So it goes beyond, he says, even stage 4 is either or, But we get to both and. It's dialectical knowing, or as he says, dialogical knowing. It's dialogic in the sense that you see the reality is so huge, even beyond you, or beyond any formulation, or beyond any religion, or beyond any conceptualization, that you're willing to listen to everybody. To listen to anyone's authentic experience that is communicated to you, and allow yourself to be changed and influenced by it. This is where interfaith dialogue comes in. This is where openness to other cultures comes in. Openness to gay people comes in. When you really just start listening to others' experience, because you realize that reality is so much, can never be put in boxes. Yeah.
So it's both and, as
Both
opposed
and.
to either or.
Yes.
And that's really the heart of it.
That's the heart of it. Conjunctive faith. So it's where you begin to really be able to dialogue with people with respect in a way that can change them and certainly can change you. And you discover, as he points out, that your own tradition, your own understanding you grow in your understanding of your own tradition by doing that. Oh, that's a point that the Buddhists make, but wow, that helps me to see something in my own tradition that I left behind that I hadn't noticed before. So wow, that's really wonderful. Not only do I have the pleasure and the joy of learning about them, but I get a gift from them that helps me to understand my own tradition. So this is the kind of faith that hopefully we can all be evolving into. So what the mystics call, he says, detachment characterizes stages 5's willingness to let reality speak its word. In other words, you don't impose your own thing on it right away, your own categories and your own limitations and your own requirements, but you let people and reality, brother, sun, sister, moon, you let them just speak to you. And that's contemplation, by the way. That's why you can only reach this, in my view. He doesn't say it in so many words, but you only can reach this by deep inner prayer, right? By really going deep down. This can be and should be, especially in our day and age, when we have a global society, which wasn't true of St. Teresa, Jesus' 16th century Spain. But we really do have a global society where we can access this kind of thing. To let reality speak its word, regardless of the impact of that word on the security or self-esteem of the knower. So this requires an immense amount of interior, personal, spiritual, and psychological maturity, where you're detached from your own security and self-esteem. I am a Baptist, so I am myself. No. Who are you when you're not that? Who are you when you're not the doctor? Who are you when you're not the Catholic? Who are you when you're not the Pope? Or as we saw in the very introduction to the book, who am I beyond the eye when I die? When you face that huge abyss. And that's part of the growth of faith, which we'll talk about next week with John of the Cross and other mystics. But this is the willingness that we show, for... So, stage 5's willingness to give reality, the initiative in the act of knowing, has to do with the trustworthiness of the known. So you believe that this is a good thing. You know from experience now this is a good thing to open yourself to reality as it is. So, stage 5 must come to terms with its own unconscious. Stage 4 was kind of stays still in its own conscious mind, as he says, but this is the way, here we are in Jung again, Carl Jung. This is where you face the shadow, where you face your own unconscious, where you face that deeper level of reality in yourself, as well as the deeper level of reality in the world, and God, etc. So you begin to not fear that. Trustworthiness of the known, not to be so afraid to go into those depths, archetypal and elements, etc., as he says. Stage 5 accepts as axiomatic that truth is more multidimensional and organically interdependent than most theories or accounts of truth can grasp. Okay? Conjunctive faith is ready for significant encounters with other traditions than its own, expecting that truth has disclosed and will disclose itself in those traditions in ways that may complement or correct its own. That's one of the rules of dialogue. If you don't enter into a dialogue, this was the rules of Thomas Swidler, rules for dialogue, the 10 Commandments of dialogue. You have to be willing to come into dialogue ready to be changed. If you're going into a dialogue without willingness to change, then don't bother. If you're just going in there to convince others, especially don't bother. There has to be a readiness to have reality speak. And you have to have the inner freedom. It's not easy to come by. That's why you got to go through the unconscious stuff and all your traumas and all your complexes. You have the inner freedom to do that. You have to be ready to be liberated. Because most people like their chains. It's comfortable. Their prisons are comfortable. Whatever kind they are, social or intellectual or religious. So it's not wishy-washy neutrality or mere fascination with the exotic features of alien cultures. No, this is a real quest for truth and a commitment to finding that, as he says. It's also, he quotes Paul Ricoeur, it's like a second naivete. When you're like a child ready to let reality speak to you and find wonder and delight in it, without self-defense. without erecting all these things. So in the final summary here of stage 5. So it's a critical recognition of one's social unconscious, what the images and etc. prejudices are that are built deeply into the systems of one's social class, religious tradition, ethnic group, or the like. Unusual before midlife. That's really pretty fundamental. This is very unusual before midlife. Why? Because most people don't face the collapse or the questioning of their comfortable systems of whatever kind before midlife. The midlife tends to bring defeats, failures, questionings, sickness, loss, all this stuff. Richard Rohr speaks a lot about this. That kind of force you into facing the abyss in a new way. Kind of force you, hopefully force you. Be grateful if it forces you to face the abyss in a new way. So this stage now makes porous and permeable, our view of life. So this stage strives to unify opposites in mind and experience. So both intellectually and in your daily life, it strives to unify the opposites. Coincidentia oppositorum, it's a Catholic phrase that was picked up by Carl Jung, the reconciliation of opposites. That's what maturity, both spiritual and psychological, is all about. Ready for closeness to that which is different and threatening to self and outlook. Wow. Ready for closeness to what is threatening. Wow. So this stage's commitment to justice is freed from the confines of tribe, class, religious community, or nation. Wow, we need that in the country today, and in the church today. Freed from the confines of tribe, class, religious community, or nation. So with the seriousness that can arise when life is more than half over, this stage is ready to spend and be spent for the cause of conserving and cultivating the possibility of others generating identity and meaning. So the new strength at this stage finally comes in the rise of the ironic imagination, he calls it. Capacity to see and be in one's or one's group's most powerful meanings while simultaneously recognizing that they are relative, partial, and inevitably distorting apprehensions of transcendent reality. So there's the both end. You recognize the value of the company, of the system, but you also simultaneously recognize how limited and ultimately distorting, if they're distorting unless you take them too seriously. Mistake them for the reality itself. They can be. So that's what happens, in stage 5. You can appreciate symbols in this without being, overwhelmed by them. So any questions on that? Remarks?
Is that the last stage?
No, stage 6 comes,
Oh.
which very few people reach. Those of you who were present a year ago summer, when I gave my course on Thomas Merton, I actually used this book to illustrate his stages of growth. And it's very, very clear in him that he went through this. When he wrote The Seven-Story Mountain, he was glorying in stage 3 faith. Then he went through his crisis, in stage 4 faith, and then by the end of his life with his Zen and with his, nonviolence and his political activism, he was stage, 5 and beyond. In fact, the author quotes Thomas Merton as one of the examples of a person who thinks reaches stage 6, so let's talk about that. It's called universalizing faith. Universalizing faith. So this is when you don't care anymore about, the constrictions that might be placed on you, what you might lose if you speak out for the truth, who you'll offend, what livelihood and reputation you'll lose, what life you may lose. And most people who are in stage 6 that actually do speak out are murdered. So this is what he has to say about it. And I'll read the whole paragraph, since this very well summarizes it. Stage 6 is exceedingly rare. The persons best described by it have generated faith compositions in which their felt sense of an ultimate environment is inclusive of all being. Truly Catholic, in other words, the original meaning of the word, which we have to recover. Actualizes of the spirit of an inclusive and fulfilled human community. They are contagious, quotes, in the sense that they create zones of liberation from the social, political, economic, and ideological shackles we place and endure on human futurity. Think of how we're suppressing the possibilities of the future by holding on to so much stuff. Continue. Living with felt participation. Living with felt participation, they're mystics in other words, in a power that unifies and transforms the world. Universalizers are often experienced as subversive of the structures, including religious structures, by which we sustain our individual and corporate survival, security, and significance. Got to get beyond survival, security, and significance. How many of us do that? Many persons in this stage, he says, die at the hands of those whom they hope to change. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, for example. Universalizers are often more honored and revered after death than during their lives. What did Jesus say? Ha! Your ancestors killed prophets and then they built their tombs, you know. The rare persons who may be described by this stage have a special grace that makes them seem more lucid, more simple, and yet somehow more fully human than the rest of us. Their community is universal in extent, and he explains. Particularities are cherished because they are vessels of the universal. Any mystic will tell you that, Buddhist or Christian or whatever. Particularities are cherished because they are vessels of the universal, and thereby valuable apart from any utilitarian consideration. The leper on the street, Francis kissed. Life is both loved, of course, and held too loosely. Such persons are ready for fellowship with persons at any of the other stages. Now, that's interesting. You can get along with the stage 3 if you're in stage 6. You don't get into an argument right away. Because you're universal, you understand the whole thing. You embrace people as they are. That's what it means to be stage 6. And from any other faith tradition, you can welcome and embrace any persons of any other faith tradition. So when asked, he says, when I'm asked whom I consider to be representatives of stage 6, I refer to Gandhi, to Martin Luther King Jr., in the last years of his life, Mother Teresa, maybe. I mean, she had universal concern. I'm also inclined to point to Dr. Hammarskjöld, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whom we're going to talk about in a subsequent class, Abraham Heschel, Thomas Merton. You can probably name other persons, as well. Not saying necessarily they're self-actualized or fully functioning, but they've reached this level of maturity. And as I say, he uses the stage 6 thing about the kingdom of God. He uses that as an image which kind of can cover, even though it's a Christian term, you're on that level of the universal kingdom of God. And again, the absoluteness in the particular, he has a whole section on that, we just mentioned that. And then he concludes this whole section with, this whole part of the book with, it is always stage 6 that people are most interested in when I talk about, he said, when I talk about these stages. The more secular the audience, the greater the interest. I asked myself, what is it about these people best described by stage 6 that enlivens our excitement and draws us out of our embeddedness in the present and the past? What is it about these persons that both condemns our obsessions with our own security and awakens our taste and sense for the promise of human futurity? I believe that these persons kindle our imaginations in these ways because in their generosity and authority, in their freedom, and in their costly love, they embody the promise and lure of our shared futurity. These persons embody costly openness to the power of the future. That's good. These persons embody costly openness to the power of the future. That future focus is so essential to real growth. Not going back to the past or the present. They actualize its promise. They actualize its promise, creating zones of liberation and sending shockwaves to rattle the cages that we allow to constrict human futurity. They rattle the cage. They shake it up, rock the boat. They rock the boat. Their trust in the power of that future and their trans-narcissistic love of human futurity account for their readiness to spend and be spent in making the kingdom actual. So that's our goal.
Stage 6. Stage 6?
Yes. I mean, each one of you knows, maybe can figure out where you think you are now, at least in the broad sense. And it's good to know these things, not to rush the process, but to know that there is a process. That's why it's good to read mystical theology, to know that this is possible. That there is a goal, that there is a growth continuum. It's important to be aware of. Because, for example, people tend to be at stage 3, as we just heard, don't even know that this isn't the ultimate thing. I sometimes tell the joke that, the people who are up in heaven standing in a circle wearing white robes and playing harps and with palm branches and halos and singing hallelujah 24 hours a day, they think that's heaven. But it's purgatory. They haven't gone beyond the symbols and all that stuff, and they think that's all there is. How sad, So, hopefully, of course, my whole point in including this as part of our course is to show that there is a journey. And what most people consider doubts, and oh boy, I shouldn't have any doubt, I should accept this beyond all doubt, as we saw last week in the formulations of faith that we got as kids. If you don't have doubt in the sense of moving beyond, the symbols and the concepts, you're not growing in faith at all. Doubt in that sense is essential to faith. That's why when people come and tell me, Father, I'm having doubts about my faith, I say, congratulations! I'm happy for you. Then you have to reassure them that this is normal. This is part of the growth in prayer and in maturity and in faith, and becoming who you're meant to be. So this opens up, perspectives for you in the ways we're going to be continuing to explore with Catholic authors and mystics and theologians and some Protestant ones, and then also some Far Eastern ones and some modern secular ones. These are the ones we're going to look at in the remaining weeks, the next 3 weeks. Yes, any final questions or comments? Yes, Bill.
What place do you think asceticism has in all of this journey? And the reason I ask is...
That depends what you mean by asceticism.
Andrew Sullivan had a really good article, I thought, in the current New York magazine, and one of the quotes he says, if the churches came to understand that the greatest threat to faith today is not hedonism, but distraction, perhaps they might begin to appeal anew, as a digital generation. He talks about the need for asceticism or discipline with regard to our distractions that are...
Yeah, so that's what you mean by asceticism, overcoming distraction and what Pascal called divertissement. We're always distracted. Even back in the 17th century, he was talking about distracting ourselves with this and that. And of course, entertainment and the internet and computers and all of that can be used in a way to avoid discovering who you really are, running away from your suffering. You can use that the same way you use drugs or alcohol or sex or anything to deaden the feeling of alienation and suffering and, you know, all these demons that you have inside. You want to run, or deaden them, or run away from them. So yeah, if you mean asceticism in that basic sense of getting rid of the obstacles, emotional and mental, and wherever they may be, that prevent our, to use the phrase from stage 5, letting reality speak to us as it is. Who are we really if we just look? Who is God really if we let God speak? What is the world, you know, if you really let your eyes look without the veils and the colors and the blinders and all the stuff that we have, that we get from our culture, from our family, and from our own psychological wounds. So asceticism in that sense is not only recommended, it's essential, of course. Anyone else? Okay, so that's 7:30, so thank you very much, and we'll see you hopefully next week, same place,
Thank you.
same station.